Hey channel, I recorded this one special request. Hope you like it as much as I do. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends. Hope you enjoy. Thanks.
And to die at the age of 50.
Chapter 1. Introduction. The bustling little town of Roxbury, New York, produced in the year 1836 a man who was to disturb the economic theories of this country, and to die at the age of 56, the possessor of one of the greatest single American fortunes, the youngest of 6 children, 5 of whom were girls. He was often soft-spoken, small, and frail. He had 1 wife and 2 daughters, and 4 sons. There was no whisper of scandal about his private life, although he loved fine houses, steam yachts, flowers, and formal gardens. He worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and had few diversions. How could he have diversions? Once he went to Amsterdam to confer with Dutch bankers and investors. It took him an hour to conclude his business conference. In another hour, he was back on his ship, impatient to get home to his family and to more complicated affairs. Jay Gould, born Jason, will always be a subject of controversy. Gould has been accused of betraying his friends, but he lived in an age when this was not uncommon. Daniel Drew and Jubilee Jim Frisk might easily have been in the penitentiaries to which some of Gould's friends did go, and to which some of his enemies gaily would have consigned him. On the other hand, he did keep many staunch friends. John Pierpont Morgan, with grim humor, called his Morgan's yacht the Corsair. Gould indulged in no such histrionics. When he testified, indeed, before a Senate committee in 1883, he had to be urged to keep his voice, for he could not be heard. He had to be urged to keep up his voice, for he could not be heard. It will, of course, be obvious to any careful or even desultory reader that the ethical standards of his time, the business practices, would today scarcely be tolerated. Gould used every stock-rigging device then known, and some he originated or at least improved. Although the convertible bond and the proxy to control companies were by no means unfamiliar, Gould could use them as a dentist uses a drill, or as a butcher uses a cleaver. The story of the Erie is so well known that the writer hesitates to include it. Yet the Erie is one of his failures. But he was young then, and perhaps he was associating with inferiors. Inferiors? He battled the Vanderbilts, the C.P. Huntington, the Charles Francis Adams Jr. He controlled the telegraph business and the Manhattan Elevated, and he tried to corner Gould, and came close to doing it. Gould was one of the first to recognize the power of that valuable house organ, the daily newspaper. He owned one and controlled the financial and editorial pages of others. Gould was born poor. His father was a respectable failure, but he rarely lacked money from the day he was 17. He was a surveyor, as Washington was, and a self-taught one, as Washington was not. He was not at all above making surveys of New York counties, which would list the properties of those who could help be useful to him, or of writing to newspapers, which could help him, and buying 6 subscriptions. There were financial transactions in his early life, when he was in the leather business, which seemed dubious and to need explanation. One man shot him in consequence of one of them. One man shot himself in consequence of one of them. It may not have been Gould's doing. At all events, he seemed to have emerged from the debacle of a bad leather market with a substantial stake and a thirst for greater enterprises. His life was a progression. He began as a speculator, a stock market manipulator. At the end, he was building railroads, not with a printing press, but with steel, and seeing himself, as perhaps essentially he was, not a pirate, not as a cunning president selling his own stock short, not as a man who was running a road into the ground, in defiance of the bondholders, but as a builder of roads. Quote, "I am not interested in Eastern roads," he said. Once, quote, "I am interested only in roads to the west. I am interested in Mexico," end quote. Gould was scarcely more than 5 feet tall, with a predisposition to both neuralgia and tuberculosis. How interesting it might have been to see him, had he lived all but a little longer, slipping gracefully away from that awkward behemoth, the Sherman antitrust law. Yes, and engaging the great Morgan with his net and trident. The man who loved flowers, who was all his life the close friend of John Burroughs, the man who loved sedately and without much ostration, and who was the Adonis, the ruthless and the splendid courage of the mongoose or the tarp tiger. This was Gould. He was trapped many times. His was no unbroken record of success. His failures were many, but when he gasped out his life at last with his children around him, he could laugh at his enemies and perhaps at the gathering shadows, for he had achieved the success which apparently was his goal. In considering Gould, it may first be useful to think of the time in which he lived. It was an age of individual enterprise. There was little government interference. Business ability had a chance. The local bank was ready to lend funds. A supply of labor was available. The essential thing was to keep costs low. The first to reduce costs was the successful man. There was Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil refining, Odin Armour in meat packing. In the railroad business, there was James J. Hill, Albert Keep, C. E. Perkins, J. E. Thompson. These men made quick deliveries, sold dependable products, carried out their contracts, and reduced costs. These things were not always enough. Open-mindedness and constructive imagination were necessary too. There was George Westinghouse, who was not merely a great inventor, but also a clever businessman, though not a good financier. Carnegie was no inventor, but he knew an inventor when he saw one, and hired him. The merchandising facility was also important. James B. Duke had this, the Rockefeller had this, and Marshall Field and Julius Roswell. In none of these fields did Gould show any particular ability. The Manhattan Elevated was not well run. The service on his railroad systems was poor. He was no innovator, no quick adopter of new ideas. He was of no help in developing the telegraph, except for eliminating competitors. And after he had done that, improvements were fewer still. Merchandising. There was no need to increase the demand for railway service. People were clamoring for it. What did the man have, then? To understand his work, it is necessary to sketch briefly the evolution of American business. In the beginning, normally, every enterprise was a means of exploiting a local opportunity. Rockefeller opened a small refinery in Cleveland. Carnegie sold axles and forgings and fittings and bridge sections in western Pennsylvania. Even the Central Pacific was organized to do a local business between California and the Silver Country in Nevada. These small local companies grew largely by consolidation. At times, this was the result of coercion. Often, it was the agreement of reasonable men. When a company had many stockholders, the task was difficult. A first mortgage bondholder, for instance, might have his own view of his own interests, and the second and third bondholders quite another. The interests of stockholders and bondholders might readily be at variance. A small decline might easily eliminate the stockholders' interests. It was not an easy task to buy control of a heavily bonded company with a widely scattered army of security holders. If the company to be acquired had defaulted on its interests, the question presented was whether control should be acquired through the purchase of bonds or stocks. In the years after 1965, when precedents had not been established, the rights of stockholders as compared with those of bondholders were not thoroughly known. Suppose a businessman had solved the question of reasonable price. He then had to take into account the question of timing, for the price might not last long. Surprisingly enough, there is little discussion of this problem in economic literature. Gould's abilities lay largely in the field of corporate negotiation and security trading. At the age of 31, in the fall of 1867, he went on the Erie board. Within less than 6 months, he became both a corporate manager and a stock trader. Sometimes his interests in a corporation were primary. Often his stock market interests were primary, and he used his position on the board to further his stock speculations. In still other cases, he had a continuous interest in both his capacities. Strictly speaking, he was not a good corporate manager. It was not until late in his career that he made any serious efforts to manage a property. After a short term as president of the Erie, he decided that was not fit for such an office. After this, he accepted executive positions only temporary, and usually because of financial necessity. In 1882, for example, he took over the presidency of the Wabash. On the other hand, he declined to become president of the Union Pacific, and he would not undertake the nominal management of his 3 major telegraph properties, the Atlantic and Pacific, the American Union, and the Western Union. His great strength was in detecting opportunities to seize control and in his ability to maintain it. If this control led to a rapid rise in securities values, frequently he sold out. The sale of his holdings did not necessarily mean the loss of control. He sold most of his Union Pacific stock by January of 1881, but he remained in control for another 3.5 years. In 1882, he sold most of his stock in the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, although through a lease he dominated the destinies of that road for another 6.5 years. He was forced into the stock market, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that his earliest interest was the market, and this led him to corporate acquisition and expansion. His knowledge was profound. There is nothing in his environment, his education, or his early training that explains this. No one knows how he may have learned it. Quiet, soft of speech, he was a secretive man. There were no public agencies to force him to publish any facts. There were no institutions representing security holders to compel him. There were courts and legislative bodies, of course, but these supplied relief only after the event. Judicial reviews and legislative inquiries produced a mass of facts and many curious and interesting stories. They rarely stopped the aggressions of an active businessman, and they rarely provided redress for the injured. When Gould's activities brought him into public notice in the fall of 1867, he was already a master in the intricate field of corporate finance. He was only 31, but he knew a great many devices, a great many methods of manipulation. He had mastered the complexities of the new banking system. He understood the still greater complexities of depreciated currency and the gold market. He knew all this so well that he undertook to do what nobody else had done, virtually to produce a scarcity of gold. This meant the withdrawal of currency, deflation of purchasing power, the bankruptcy of traders and merchants, and general economic disruption. All of this Gould accomplished. In addition, he he suddenly appeared as the master in the field of corporate expansion. He made a thorough examination of the intricate relations between the eastern truck lines and their western connections. He must have consulted widely with many men, since he could not have found an answer in any published source. Operating in his twin fields, corporate relationships and security manipulations, Gould displayed a streak of objectivity, of cold-bloodedness, of lack of emotion. Personal scruples seemed to have been lacking in him. If a thing had to be done, it was done. There were legislators and judges to be bribed and bought. Gould outbid Vanderbilt. The same objectivity was carried out in his personal relationships. He picked his associates carefully. When an ally no longer suited his needs, he dropped him. But he picked up many a former foe. Thus, Richard Schell and H.F. Clark, who had opposed him in the Erie imbroglio in 1868, became his fast friends. An example of even greater significance was Russell Sage, who was his foe and afterwards his steadfast business friend. Gould could strike back at any time. He was patient. He was even-tempered. He was cool and calculating, and he picked his time to strike. In dealing with opponents, he honored only the letter of the contract, and wherever possible, he avoided contractual relations. To his loyal followers, however, he was a man of his word. He never flinched from carrying out a promise, even at the cost of heavy personal sacrifice. He would do this. Quote, I never was with a more reliable and more considerate man than Jay Gould, end quote, said a great railroad builder, General G.M. Dodge. Many others testified in a similar way. W.E. Connor, the stockbroker who in 1884 staunchly protected Gould's weakening speculative position, looked up to Gould as to one of the most loyal persons he had ever met. Sage could not praise Gould enough for his steadfast loyalty. Sidney Dillon, his associate in the Union Pacific from 1874 to 1884, and again in 1890 and 1891, was another Gould admirer. His operating chiefs, A.L. Hopkins, Sloane Humphreys, and others, repeatedly expressed their affection for him. E.H. Nichols, a railroad man who negotiated with Gould in several Western railroad transactions, told a government investigating committee, quote, I never knew Mr. Gould to put his finger to anything that was not straight, end quote. Isaac Jones Wister, a distinguished and public-spirited citizen of Philadelphia, declared that Gould was, quote, staunch and true, end quote. In every period of market reversal, when he was long of the market with securities bought on borrowed funds, Gould might sell, although he himself had recently recommended such purchases. He switched his trading position frequently. As a controller of a corporation, he would be on both sides of the market, in combination with other traders, with whom he formed market pools. He took trading positions which were tenable only because of his superior knowledge as a member of the board. To many such transactions were utterly reprehensible. J. M. Forbes, a typical New England businessman and capitalist, characterized Gould as a raider by profession. Gould, nevertheless, was not a successful stock trader. What he gained by sharp practice, he frequently lost in a general smash. His thorough knowledge of the art and practice of corporate finance did not make him popular. He was forever examining characters and leases and mortgages and bonds. He looked constantly for weak spots. He found them, and thus often acquired control. The subsequent rises in price would bring forth an army of enraged former security holders. Then he would sell out at the higher prices, and again they would be enraged. In short, he carried over into the field of corporate management the art and principle of security trading. An investor or speculator may admire a shrewd trader. When such a trader is also a director of a corporation, the holder of securities may well regard him somewhat differently. Strange as it may seem, many of Gould's financial schemes were sound. He was an advanced thinker in the field of corporate finance, and he set precedences which were later followed in investment bankers and by state and federal legislators. On the other hand, many of the things which Gould did can no longer be done. In the uncontrolled economy of his day, he was a leader. He introduced many methods which now are disapproved. The railroad mortgages of the middle 90s contained many clauses designed to prevent some of the things which he had done. So do the state regulatory acts and the Transportation Act of 1920. As a trader, he was not too successful. Although not a business manager, most of his personal fortune came from two large properties which he controlled and supervised, the Western Union and the Manhattan Elevated. He was successful as the operator of only a single railroad, the Missouri Pacific, over which he exercised an intimate supervision. In the following pages, an effort is made to trace the career of this leading trader, businessman, and capitalist in an era of unregulated business competition. That is the end of chapter 1.